the mindful cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. Well, I'd like to welcome Miguel Farias to the Mindful Cranks. He is the co-author of the book, The Buddha Pill. Excellent book. The Buddha Pill, Can Meditation Change You?, which is now in its second edition, co-authored with Catherine Wikholm, and published by Watkins Media. So thank you, Miguel, for joining us in this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm really looking forward to it too, Ron. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's interesting. You start out in the Buddha Pill. You reveal very early on that your parents, I assume it was your parents,
yep,
were TM, Transcendental Meditation practitioners, when you were much younger, and which later you would be seeing just how that may have influenced your career and your research interest in studying the effects of meditation and yoga. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your journey and career in this area, a little bit about your background, and then what led you to write The Buddha Pill. That might be a good place to start.
Yeah, sure. The episodes of being introduced to TM through my parents when I was a kid. Perhaps I should give just a tiny bit of the background. So this is very different from being introduced to TM by hippie parents, say in San Francisco. Portugal had just come out of a very long dictatorship, so it was a very backwards country. And there was this explosion of interest when there was a democratic revolution in 1974. So there was this explosion of interest in all sorts of new things. So my father was in the military. My mother was a history teacher. And this was something which was being presented to the military. So they had a cheap course on TM. So that was my first introduction to meditation. I felt somewhat nostalgic looking at the research a few years ago, because I saw again those wonderful photos of these people in the 1960s, young people, and they looked like they were levitating with big smiles on their faces. So that was a bit of a nostalgic trip. My parents didn't do it for a very long time, probably for just about 1 year. My dad kept doing it for longer, but just on his own. But I suppose it's kindled some interest, which remain with me. So when I came to England from Portugal to do my doctorate, I was already focusing on alternative spirituality and practices like energy healing, but also meditation. But it was only some years later, after I finished my doctorate, that I met some people from a charity which has been organizing meditation and yoga classes across British prisons for over 20 years. And that led us to conduct our first randomized controlled trial of yoga and meditation. So the original idea for the book was actually to focus more strongly on that aspect. So looking at personal change through meditation, but with these people who are in a particularly difficult, vulnerable position. And then as the book grew and I kept talking to Catherine, who was then starting her doctorate in clinical psychology, it sort of opened up to other possibilities. So this is very much the background. I mean, of course, that I had been thinking about meditation and the idea of personal transformation associated with it for a very long time. And so this was a sort of possibility of really getting to grips with it.
Yeah, that's right. I remember reading that initially you had a different title for the book. It was something like "From Monsters to Buddhas."
Oh yes, yes,
So
that's true.
yes, so you were intending initially before you journeyed into this investigation of focusing more on the positive possibilities for personal change through meditation. So, what changed your mind as you embarked on this research?
Yes. So
That's a big question. So
it
we'll unpack that.
no, that's true. So I remember now that when we had the book proposal accepted, so for instance, it didn't have that chapter on the dark side, which became, a very big thing with the media.
The dark side of meditation.
Yeah, the
yes.
dark side of meditation. The original plan in our original book proposal was to look at potential negative benefits, but more associated to cult-like behavior. And this changed because out of the research we were doing, we came across some of the early literature on adverse effects of meditation, and also one of my students, who had been herself a yoga and meditation teacher, told me about a severe psychotic episode she had after a meditation retreat. So it slowly started building. Also looking at, and this is really, I suppose, a special benefit and privilege of writing a book on this, and not just an academic article. It gave us the opportunity to go deeper into the history of this, which was quite something. But once you have a wider perspective of both the positive sides and the limitations of this, of course, that we felt that we had to bring that into the book. It couldn't just be one more book about, how ecstatic, how wonderful meditation is, which is why it gave a much more nuanced portrayal of meditation.
Yes. And you mentioned Transcendental Meditation in the chapter. You have a whole chapter devoted to that. And I think you really tell a fascinating story about how TM, it almost reads like a detective story as you dive into the so-called scientific research that was conducted on TM going back as far as 1970. Yes. I think this is a really important documentary of how an Asian contemplative practice became mainstream, which set the cultural foundation for the rise of Buddhist forms of mindfulness. I think there are many parallels we can explore. But first, I think it's important to touch on this history of TM, as it tills the cultural soil. It sets the groundwork for the mindfulness movement, in my opinion. And I never knew that Maharishi had an undergraduate degree in physics. I never knew that.
Yes, indeed.
and I also didn't really know the religious origins of Transcendental Meditation was going back to Advaita Vedanta. Could you give us a little background on TM? Just a little bit.
Yeah, well, as you know, modern Advaita Vedanta, is huge. And there's now in the West various schools or people who claim to be following the Advaita Vedanta movement. The origins of this go back to Shankara a long time ago. But so he was the one who came up with a very clear understanding that we're all parts of the same thing, and we just have to realize that we are part of the same spiritual essence, which binds everything together. And the idea of our individuality, our separate individuality, is just an illusion. It's very, very sophisticated in the origins. The way Maharishi looks at it, it's already embedded in a much more practical context in which meditation plays a big role. Shankara, for instance, doesn't think that meditation, being part of our experience, can liberate oneself. Liberation is something more of an intellectual realization that can only be given by someone who has already attained it. But so Maharishi was initiated by his own Advaita Vedanta guru, and then when he came to the West, and this was influenced and shaped by meeting people like the Beatles, who made him very quickly famous in the West. But he was very clever. He did understand that the West was very different from India, and that to make this acceptable, he had to have scientists looking at it. And this is why we call TM the first wave of meditation studies. So it really starts off in 1970. So they published the first article in Science. And then after 7 years, they have about 100 articles, and looking very much at all the things that mindfulness would then 20, 30 years onwards be interested in. So the physiology of meditation, the psychology of meditation, the neuroscience of meditation, and also the potential pro-social effects of meditation. So the kind of scientific agenda that they bring forward is really, really, I think, key to understand how then when mindfulness comes in, it's become much more acceptable. Having reread the chapter yesterday, I think there's other things playing in the background. So, as you know, meditation and other things in the 60s were very much countercultural, but 30, 40 years onwards, quite a lot of these ideas and practices, like meditation, but even psychotherapy, things like psychotherapy were also somewhat countercultural. They become much more widely accepted. Something which I have learned since we've published the book is that there is also a longer history to relaxation exercises, which were also influenced by Eastern practices. So this goes back to the 1920s and 30s in the US. And there was already back in the 30s a book by Jacobson, which was then used by cognitive behavior therapy. But some of the ideas of meditation and relaxation really, really overlap very, very tightly.
Yeah, the Mind Cure movement.
Exactly.
The Theosophical Society, all those sorts of influences were occurring at the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century. So yes. And the scientific justification aspect of the legitimizing role that science plays in TM was huge. It's interesting, the trajectory. It starts out glowing, but as time goes on, we begin to see more critical studies emerge around TM. Article in Science came out basically finding there were no major effects of transcendental meditation, really no different than relaxation, and no difference in stress levels, which was quite astounding. There was actually a finding, if I recall, that experienced meditators were actually sleeping, right?
Yeah. So TM, again, this was a sort of curious idea. Maharishi had some avant-garde ideas, such as them proposing that people which were doing a more advanced program of TM could actually develop some kind of parapsychological abilities, such as levitating. But he was interested in trying to show scientifically that TM gave rise to a fourth state of consciousness, which again comes from Advaita Vedanta, in which there's supposed to be a fourth state of consciousness, which is characterized by that sense of consciousness where there is no individuality. But and the first paper they published in Science was trying to say that here we have some physiological and neuroscientific correlates showing that this is different from being awake, being asleep, or being hypnotized. But then again, 7 years later, new research was done showing that actually we can't replicate these findings. So that's just not clear.
And Herbert Benson, who was very actively involved, wasn't he, in the early research on TM?
Yeah, Herbert Benson.
Didn't he retract his claim? Didn't he eventually retract his claim that it produced a unique state of consciousness?
Yeah, he then said that exactly that relaxation and meditation are similar strategies that lead to the same results. And more recently, I think he would also put prayer in the mix. So he calls all of these relaxation strategies.
Right. Now the same problem we see with TM, the research on TMs, the similar problems we've been seeing with mindfulness studies and research on mindfulness. But you tell a story of Jonathan Smith. The problem of control groups. I mean, control groups in meditation research have been problematic. It's hard to come up with a placebo in meditation research. But you tell the story of Jonathan Smith, who was quite fascinating to see that. Quite an ingenious thing that he did. He created an active control group. And created a false intervention. He called it periodic somatic inactivity methodology, which he created a 71-page manual to go along with it. That was really fascinating.
I thought he was really, really creative. I have been in touch with one of the major TM researchers, David Orm Johnson, who really, really hates those papers. And some other mindfulness researchers also think that it is implausible that you can pull that off. I mean, in the sense that it's not just a sham meditation, but you manage to trick even the person who's giving the intervention. So that's really quite something, that you give this manual to someone who actually believes that, oh yes, this is a new kind of meditation. But
even the researcher. That's hard to pull off. So after 3 months, of the study, I guess he went back in to assess, right? Anxiety, muscle tension, autonomic arousal, but he found no differences between TM and this fake meditation. Meditation.
So they were both better. They had better outcomes than just the control.
Just the passive control. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
And the whole thing on levitation that you write about was quite remarkable. And it's kind of ironic that that Maharishi introduces this kind of new course on how to attain these city powers, and but that was in the midst of studies that were beginning to criticize TM. So I found the timing kind of interesting. That the rhetoric and the claims and all these appeals to world peace, and that somehow it'll miraculously change the world. We hear the same rhetoric in the mindfulness movement, that it'll lead to world peace, it'll usher in a global renaissance, it'll reform the U.S. military, it'll solve climate change.
But you're right, there's another, that is a really interesting similarity between TM and mindfulness too, that they have a political agenda.
Well, very utopian, there is a political agenda in there that is not scientific at all, but it's kind of utilizing the authority or the guise of science, right? To push that agenda. And also, another surprise from reading this chapter was to learn just how much involved Deepak Chopra was in TM, and I really didn't know that.
No, I didn't know about it either, that he had been a major figure in the TM movement. It's really, really fascinating. And so he was involved in something which I also didn't know about, that TM had its own brand of herbal products.
Yeah, amazing. And you mentioned a story about a research study where in the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most prestigious medical journals, that he failed to disclose this conflict of interest, right?
Yeah, and yes, and then he took to court the American Medical Association when
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yes, when the critiques started coming in, and then one of the editors wrote an article exposing the sort of commercial relationship. I think they settled out of court.
Wow. Let's turn to this very famous experiment. I also was fascinated by this experiment, but you tell it in a lot more detail than I do. It's the Washington D.C. experiment, and I find this experiment very interesting because it reminds me of some of the hypotheses and claims of the mindfulness movement in many ways too. So can you tell us a little bit about that Washington D.C. experiment?
Yeah, so that is related to the other thing that TM was trying to push, which was this pro-social aspect. Meditation is not just beneficial for the individual, but it can benefit society. Now, the mindfulness movement is also making similar claims. The difference is that the Maharishi came up with somewhat of a quantic New Age psychology idea that if you had a number of meditators together, there would be an influence on the kind of consciousness, planetary consciousness around them. And he had a particular ratio of how many people you need to affect a certain geographical area. So there are over 50 studies that are trying to show how this effect is real, this Maharishi effect, as it's called. And that experiment you're referring to, which was, I think it's still the most expensive experiment in meditation, in which they brought in 4,000 meditators.
4,000 people was about a $4 million experiment.
Yes. Yeah. So you had to bring all of these people who were meditating, for most of the day across various weeks. And the idea was that the influence of this meditation would affect the consciousness field around that area of the center of Washington, D.C., and would then sort of bring down the levels of collective stress, which they think is the major stimulator of crime. And then they were comparing the periods in which these people were doing meditation there with the crime rates of the previous year. It's a fascinating idea.
So, in actuality, though, I guess that, as you report, that there was actually a 50% increase in homicides. So the crime rate, at least when it comes to homicides, actually shot up during this period. But that didn't make it into their research article. They published an article, right, 6 years after the experiment. Yeah,
so the results are ambiguous. So they did report that there was a decrease in some crimes, like rape, a 15% decrease. And when they had more meditators, the decrease was even more pronounced. But there wasn't a difference for things like homicide. But then as we dug deeper into it, we noticed that there was actually an even higher rate of homicide. And part of this was justified because there had been a horrendous mass murder during that period. So the results are much more ambiguous than they originally seem. But I still think it's a fascinating idea, and it sort of, reverberates with the desire that people have genuinely have to see that meditation does move beyond the boundaries of the individual self, that their effects can affect others.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a complete negation of that possibility. That's for sure. But I think that there's a broader issue here that isn't this use of science, isn't it being used in some ways to justify a strategy for modernizing a religion? I just interviewed Evan Thompson about his new book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist, in the last episode. And
excellent.
And he speaks of this idea of justification. Actually, there's two modes. He talks about embellishment and justification. And so, I see a similar thing happening with mindfulness, that science comes in to say, look, meditation works, right? And in a way, it's I think it's falling prey to that use of science as a kind of legitimizing strategy for modernization. I don't know. It seems a bit like...
I absolutely agree. But this has been happening, particularly within science conducted in the US for a while. So there is a separate movement looking at the benefits of religion, right? So there's a huge literature on health and religion. Yeah. And I think that in that sense, that the mindfulness literature is just an extension. I think, look, we can also look at, it's not just Western Christian religion. These Buddhist-based practices also seem to be beneficial for individuals. So in that sense, it is still, no matter whether you want to call it secularized or not, but it's still a kind of curious, religious or spiritual agenda. And this is where I have some issues with. And it's right now it's somewhat unfashionable to talk about intellectual dishonesty, but there's been quite a lot of maneuvering, ideological maneuvering, both from TM and mindfulness, which I think we can properly address as intellectual dishonesty, which is you come up with something which you pretend it to be secular when you know it is not. And the most explicit case is when you've tried to bring both TM and mindfulness into schools. So this isn't a big issue in Europe, but in the US, you can't bring religious teachings into schools, right?
Yeah.
So what these programs have done when they ran into trouble is just change the names. So they came up with more psychological names, and they kept the program exactly the same.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And Kabat-Zinn, so who started the mindfulness-based stress reduction and who's really the initiator of the science of mindfulness, he has this article from some years ago, a kind of confessional article saying that the idea for this package came to him after 10 days of a meditation retreat. And he's very, very open about the idea. He said, well, I'm just going to package this in a way that doesn't look like what it really is.
Yeah.
Right? So this is all new age stuff. And I won't be able to sell it as such. So I'll just call it something else.
Yeah. Oh, well, I know.
Yeah. And I think here we have a cultural divide. I suppose in the US, where there is a very open salesman spirit, sure, why not? This is what we do all the time. And lots of the self-help literature is coming from the same principle. We just kind of stretch some basic science and twist it as much as we can to sell this. So they have done that. I think there's lots of intellectual dishonesty in that. It's really not addressing things as they really are.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really appreciated about your book was just how how careful you were in kind of dissecting many of these studies, reading between the lines, noticing the sleight of hand on some of the decisions on the part of researchers to leave out certain sets of data, or it's just a whole kind of game that I think has kind of become, I guess, normal in the field. The positive reporting bias, the experimental effects, all these kinds of problematic methodological issues that I think when you read your account of this, I really get the feeling of surprise, and you were kind of startled to see some of these moves that were being made in the research.
Yeah, no. I mean, I wasn't being disingenuous about that. I was genuinely surprised by quite a lot of the things that I learned through doing the research and the reading for this. And I'm genuinely, happy that since we've written the book, this has become more and more explicit. So a couple of years ago, some mindfulness researchers, some of them, some leading mindfulness researchers, like from different areas, from neuroscience to clinical psychology, wrote this article called Mind the Hype.
Yeah, Mind the Hype, great article. Yeah,
which is precisely, addressing how so much of the mindfulness literature has just, it's just been portrayed in a way which is simply not accurate. So it's tremendously inflated, and this has all sorts of bad consequences when research retouches upon medical aspects. Is clearly not accurate.
Yeah, and being situated in the United Kingdom with the NHS and how MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, has been given priority status, and you bring it up in the book that you're somewhat surprised by that, because the relapse rate. MBCT is an intervention to prevent the relapse of depression, correct? That's how it's been presented.
Yes.
But evidently, the efficacy isn't as strong as people make it out to be, if I'm picking up your interpretation.
Well, the best meta-analysis on this by Goyal from some years ago, it shows that the best effects for these various mindfulness therapies are for precisely recurrent depression, anxiety, and pain. And although there's still some aspects which we don't understand, and it's specifically for recurrent depression, for people who have had 3 or more episodes of depression. And it's really horrible how as you have more than one episode of depression, the chances that you get it again, just go up tremendously. So, once you have it 3 times, you're very, very likely to have it again. So people like Mark Williams, who was the director for a long time of the Oxford Mindfulness Center, he was interested in Buddhist practices from Theravada Buddhism, but he was a leading expert on recurrent depression, which is, I think, why the MBCT model seems to be more effective than the one created by Kabat-Zinn. So the results for stress, for instance, in this meta-analysis, are much, much weaker than for recurrent depression, which is somewhat ironic. But there's still lots of things that we're unsure about. One of them being this effect that Mark Williams found in one of his last studies before he retired, and which has been replicated in other studies, which is that MBCT seems to work better, particularly for those who are more vulnerable, who have a higher index of traumatic experiences early in life. And they can't really explain why that is. It's a fascinating finding now from various studies. which again highlights the importance of what psychologists call individual differences, and that people don't react in the same way to something like meditation. Again, something which has been practically unexplored. Why that happens? Because meditation techniques have been trying to be sold as universally applicable.
Right. I mean, that's one of the myths that you actually debunk, is that, this notion that mindfulness is good for everyone is simply not true.
Yeah, about a couple of years ago, I spoke to Charles Startz. Charles Startz was a very influential psychologist in the 1970s, writing about altered states of consciousness. And he told me that he had meditated for about 10 years because all of his friends were doing it and he thought it was good. After 10 years, he gave up because he never got anything out of it.
Yeah, I met Charles.
But there you go. Oh, yes, yeah. And I'm sure this happens with lots of people.
Right. I mean, it kind of promises that it will, lead to these deep personal changes, that meditation alone will be enough. And I think that one thing, if there's one big takeaway from this book, is that no, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, and these kind of washed down models of meditation, quite likely not. I don't think that's necessarily a bad side to it, because the fact that this is a more sanitized and controlled type of meditation is less likely to lead to more altered states of mind, which I think most people wouldn't be able to handle without some clear guidance.
Right. Well, you have a chapter, I think that was one of the first to really expose the dark side of meditation. And after reading this chapter, I was surprised to learn that, through your own research and investigations, that your perspective changed. Because you didn't go into this book trying to negate meditation or mindfulness. I mean, you really didn't go into this whole project with that intention. In fact, it was the opposite. But I think that you were one of the first to really kind of formally in this book talk about the adverse effects. And there's so many stories of people who after attending a meditation retreat had to be hospitalized. And at first you thought, well, maybe it's just due to, a prior disposition towards mental illness. But the more you got into this, the more you discovered that that's not necessarily the case. Is that right? Yeah,
I mean, lots of good and bad things have come out of that chapter. I mean, some of the good things is that I've spoken a lot now with some people who have been doing some of the ground research on that recently, like Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindahl. And they have some really difficult stories to digest about people who have had some of these adverse effects. Such as one story that sticks in my mind is that of a mother of young children who stopped having any sort of positive emotions or any kind of emotions, any kind of effect towards her young children. This, not to mention the more extreme psychotic episodes, but lots of people became angry about this chapter. I've lost more than one friend because of it. And the aftermath of it is that I felt that I had to do something more about this to give a more rounded and comprehensive understanding of meditation, which led me to, together with a couple of colleagues, to put together a huge handbook, which you're taking part, the Oxford Handbook of Meditation.
Right.
Yeah. So there's different aspects to this dark side. I mean, one, is coming from historical research, how meditation was used by the military, the Japanese military during the Second World War, for instance, to sort of depersonalize.
Right, we've had Brian Victoria.
Yeah, Brian Victoria.
Yeah, we've had Brian Victoria on this podcast, and he's a friend of mine.
Oh, great!
Yeah, author of Zenit War. Right.
Yeah, fascinating work. But then there's also the psychological literature, which stretches back to the 1970s. So you have people like Alice, one of the founders of cognitive behavior therapy, and Lazarus, another one, talking about the potential adverse effects of meditation and giving specific cases of some of their clients. And I mean, every couple of years there's a new article on this. But with the boom of mindfulness, this was completely, hidden under the carpet. It's and I suppose this chapter helped to bring about a greater awareness of this, so that now the various mindfulness centers are more careful about screening participants. We've just finished a kind of systematic review of the literature from the 1970s, so almost 50 years of literature on this. And I think that the major thing which we found is that there's a difference when you're doing meditation in a controlled therapeutical setting or in a different uncontrolled setting, whether this is on your own with an app or just going to occasional classes. So when you're doing it in a guided way within a therapeutic setting, it's much less likely that you'll come across these adverse effects, because if something negative, strongly negative, is coming up, this will be picked up by the people who are running the study or the therapists. But if you're doing it on your own, you're much, much more likely to come across something unwanted or potentially harmful. So overall, and when we talk about what kind of adverse events we found, clearly the most common are increases in anxiety and depression.
Huh, very interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Doing it on your own, it's never meant to be a highly individualistic activity to begin with.
No, it's you're absolutely right. It's not originally, and throughout, most of the history of meditation, and again, it's curious that we have, recently developed this idea of meditation as an individual practice, and here I think you're absolutely right. Also in your own work on this, when you talk about the downside of looking at this in such an individualistic framework, so that, if employees are stressed, let's give them meditation. So it makes it their own responsibility to sort out their stress. And the same thing is applicable, of course, to children in schools who are made to meditate, sometimes, in a non-voluntary basis, which is rather astonishing. So yes, we all know that there is an increase in anxiety and depression in children. And what we're doing is again putting the onus on them. Oh, there you go, you do this, and this will make you more resilient to mental health problems. I sometimes find it astonishing that we have reduced our mental life to such simplistic terms.
Well, that's the hidden ideological commitment to neoliberalism, which is the contextual influence on these practices.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think this has really influenced science itself and how we think about the mind. I sometimes call this the gym model of the mind, because mindfulness people like very much to sometimes use these, really, really misleading metaphors of the mind as a muscle.
Right. Exercise your mental fitness. Right. Yeah. It's a privatized view of the mind. It's a brain-centric view. All these kinds of issues are all tied together in many ways. This Evan Thompson really hammers on that too in his book. This whole idea of seeing meditation as this private inner telescope that objectively looks at the interior world. Kind of divorced and from one's context and an embodied social context, social, economic, historical context.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are clear historical roots to this extreme acute individualism, and but to see this in action in these meditation models that are now being taken to schools, it's really, really astonishing.
Well, I was really surprised to learn about Stan Grof, a prominent researcher in consciousness studies and altered states of consciousness here in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was a resident at Esalen for many years, but I never knew that his work on spiritual emergencies actually influenced a category in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM manual, a whole category called religious and spiritual problems. I never knew that.
Yes. Yes.
In one of the,
I was just saying that I've recently heard one of the people who managed to do that telling the story of how they went about it. But yes, it was clearly influenced. I think it's potentially the only bit of transpersonal psychology which you find in the DSM.
Yeah, and this one of the adverse effects is depersonalization. Could you say more what that looks like?
Yes. So it's really a kind of dissociative experience where the sense of who you usually find yourself to be either disappears or is dislocated. So, I mean, it's really difficult to actually imagine how it feels like not to be yourself, and unless you have had the experience. But it's again something that is sometimes associated with some extreme practices, particularly intensive meditation. But I mean, Grof finds a whole variety of things that may lead to it, including, of course, experiences having to do with hallucinogenics.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's bring up this point that I think is really important, and the way you describe it is, the idea that we can meditate 22 hours a day. We could be really dedicated, but during those 2 remaining hours, that's where a lot of problems occur. Can you say what you mean by that sort of portrayal?
Well, it's a sort of anecdote which came up when we interviewed 2 people from very different traditions, but both of them monastic. So people with religious vows, both from one was a Hindu Swami and the other a Benedictine monk. And they both said the same, curiously, I mean, without us asking anything leading to that you can be in a sort of blissful state while meditating 28 hours a day, but for the remaining 2 hours, you can be a very selfish individual. So it's not, and again here, it's not that meditation necessarily allows you to have this superhuman control over who you are, or that this will transform you at a level which you will be changed permanently. And of course, I mean, the various metaphysical frameworks give you different answers to this. The Benedictine monk would, of course, put the emphasis on God. That, I mean, it's you make the effort, but ultimately it's God who saves you. But the Hindu Swami would also say that, well, I mean, yes, I do meditate 5 hours a day, but I just do this and then it's out of my hands. It's not that I'm in control of where this is going to lead me or not. But what they're saying, it's actually, I think, fills me with hope, because it brings us back to a sense of vulnerability, right? We are human, so I mean, we're not using meditation to create sort of Marvel or DC superheroes. We're doing it, yes, because we're seeking something of a higher spiritual nature, but if we fall into the mistake of thinking that this will allow us to just escape our humanity, that's just nonsense.
Well, what are you working on now, Miguel? I think that would be, you mentioned the Handbook of Meditation. Could you say more about that?
Yes, I'm very, very looking forward to finishing this. It's been now over 3 years in the making. So we've been working with Oxford University Press to produce this huge handbook, I mean, of which I think we're ultimately very proud of, because we've managed to bring together the experts from various fields, so neuroscience, anthropology, sociology, but clinical psychology. But we've also brought in the experts from the various religious traditions on meditation, so from Taoism to Hinduism to Buddhism. So yeah, I think that it's actually the kind of, and we've worked really hard to make the writing accessible to someone who's not an expert in these areas. So I think it's the kind of handbook that actually I would love to have read before starting to write our book, The Buddha Pill, because it would have made clear some things which I struggled with since then. And I mean, and it gives a really, really clear idea of the breadth, the sort of insight, the tensions also between the various traditions and within the science of it. There's fascinating things and insights and also tensions, of course. I mean, because these, within the various spiritual traditions, I mean, things do not happen in a void. The experience does not happen in a void. And so people have different ways of reading what meditation does, how it relates to various spiritual teachings.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I think I really look forward to seeing that handbook. That's great. Fantastic. And you're teaching, where are you teaching now? Just so people know.
So my lab is now at Coventry University, although most of my career was at Oxford. So we've been doing also some studies on meditation. Another one, a huge meta-analysis on individual differences, something which we touched upon in the interview, trying to understand how people with some base characteristics may react better or worse to meditation practice.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. Yeah. Well, Miguel, thank you so much for this conversation and the elaboration on your book, The Buddha Pill. I hope everyone takes a look at it. And thank you so much. Miguel Farias received his doctorate in experimental psychology from the University of Oxford, where he was a lecturer until 2014, and a research associate at the Psychology of Religion group at Cambridge University. He currently leads the Brain, Belief, and Behaviour research group at Coventry University. Dr. Farias has pioneered research on the analgesic effects of religious beliefs and the stress buffering effects of science beliefs. He led the first randomized-controlled trial on the effects of yoga and meditation in prison, and is the lead author of The Buddha Pill, Can Meditation Change You? A book that examines the science and the myths about the effects of these practices. It's now in its second edition, published by Watkins Media. Dr. Farias is chief editor of the forthcoming Handbook of Meditation, to be published by Oxford University Press. You have been listening to the Mindful Cranks. Thanks to those who have sent us comments and suggestions. We really appreciate your feedback. Please write a review for us if you can on iTunes. You can listen to our podcast on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and many other podcast platforms. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, mindfulcranks.com, where you can find show notes and many of our articles and publications. Thank you for listening.